Daniel Shaw never asked for attention, yet attention always seemed to find him in the ways. He grew up in a small Kansas town, the kind of place where kids spent summers playing baseball on dusty fields and winters hunting in the woods. From the outside, Shaw seemed like any other boy, tall, wiry, and determined. But he had one trait that set him apart: a faint, uncontrollable tremor in his hands. It wasn't the kind of shaking that made everyday life impossible. He could eat, write, even throw a ball without much trouble. But when precision was required, when steady fingers mattered, his hands betrayed him. The doctors called it a mild familial tremor, nothing life-threatening, just inconvenient. To Shaw, though, it felt like a curse. In high school, he dreamed of following in his late father's footsteps. His father had been a decorated soldier, a man people in town spoke of with pride. Shaw wanted nothing more than to wear the uniform and prove himself worthy of that legacy. When he enlisted, his mother tried to hide her worry. "Just remember," she told him, "strength isn't about being perfect, it's about what you do when you're not." He carried those words with him to basic training, though he didn't yet understand their weight. Boot camp was brutal. Shaw ran until his lungs burned, crawled through mud until his arms gave out, and carried packs that felt heavier than his own body. Through it all, he never complained. But during rifle drills, his tremor betrayed him. The M16 felt like an extension of every doubt he had about himself. Other recruits noticed quickly. When his hands wavered at the range, they smirked. When his shots landed slightly off target, they chuckled. Soon the nickname was born. "Careful, don't let Shaky Shaw cover your back," one soldier called out during training. The laughter spread like wildfire. It didn't matter that he outran half of them in endurance drills. It didn't matter that he carried more weight than anyone else without falling behind. What stuck, the only thing they remembered, was the shake in his hands. The name clung to him like sweat in the scorching sun. At night, when the barracks quieted and the others drifted to sleep, Shaw lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He replayed every insult, every whisper of laughter. The more he fought the tremor, the worse it seemed to get, as though his own body was conspiring against him. Still, he refused to break. He rose earlier than the others, trained harder, and pushed himself past exhaustion. If he couldn't silence the shake, he would drown it in sheer willpower. Yet the name followed him. Even the drill sergeants used it, sometimes mockingly, sometimes simply because it stuck. Shaky Shaw, front and center. They barked the words with a smirk, and though Shaw obeyed every command, his stomach twisted each time. He told himself it didn't matter. Names were just words, but deep down he knew words had power. There was one moment during training that Shaw never forgot. On the rifle range, after a particularly rough day of missed shots, Sergeant pulled him aside. Was a grizzled veteran, a man who rarely spoke softer than a shout. But that evening his tone shifted. "You know, Shaw," he said, lighting a cigarette, "every soldier's got a weakness. Some can't run, some can't fight, some can't think straight under fire. Yours is just obvious. The question isn't whether you've got a flaw, it's whether you'll let it own you." Shaw didn't reply. He didn't know how, but those words burned into his memory. By the time training ended, Shaw had earned his place in the unit, but the nickname remained. It followed him like an invisible patch sewn onto his uniform. He hated it, but he carried it quietly, the way he carried everything else. What no one realized, not the recruits who mocked him, not even Shaw himself, was that the name would one day become part of a story no one would laugh at. A story that would spread far beyond a dusty Kansas town, far beyond the walls of a training base. For now, though, he was just Shaky Shaw, a soldier with trembling hands, a bruised pride, and a quiet determination to prove that he was more than a cruel nickname. The desert sun in Afghanistan was nothing like the sun back home in Kansas. In Kansas, summer heat carried the smell of cut grass and distant thunderstorms. In Afghanistan, it burned like an unforgiving torch, beating down on the soldiers until sweat soaked their uniforms. For Private First Class Daniel Shaw, this new world was both a test and a chance to finally step out from under the shadow of the name Shaky Shaw. His unit had been assigned to one of the most high-stakes tasks of the deployment, protecting Major General Robert. The general was a man whose reputation reached every corner of the army. He was known for his strict discipline, his sharp eye, and his intolerance for weakness. Soldiers spoke of him with a mix of respect and dread. Guarding him wasn't just a duty, it was a test of trust. Any mistake, no matter how small, could cost lives. For Shaw, that weight pressed heavily on his shoulders. The other soldiers in the unit didn't forget who he was or what they called him back in training. When he fumbled a magazine during drills, someone muttered, "Don't drop it when the general's around, Shaky." When he practiced his marksmanship, others watched out of the corners of their eyes, waiting for the tremor to betray him. He could feel the doubt everywhere, not just in their words but in their silences. They didn't trust him, not fully. And worse, he wasn't sure he trusted himself. The general, of course, had no idea who Shaw was beyond a name on a roster, but Shaw noticed the way he carried himself. He had the kind of presence that made everyone straighten their posture the second he walked into a room. His voice was crisp, his words measured, and when he gave an order, there was no hesitation. Soldiers joked that could make a stone stand at attention. Shaw admired the man, even feared him. The general represented everything Shaw wanted to be: steady, reliable, unshakable. And yet, irony hung heavy, because the one soldier tasked with protecting him was the one soldier everyone thought couldn't hold steady at all. The weight of expectation grew during every patrol. The armored convoy would roll through dusty roads, engines rumbling, and Shaw would sit with his rifle ready, eyes scanning ridges and rooftops. Sweat would trickle down his back, and every bump in the road made his grip tighten. His sergeant, a broad-shouldered man named, gave him constant reminders. "Shaw, don't forget, you're guarding a general, not a supply truck. One slip and it's over." The words cut deeper than the sergeant knew. Shaw already told himself that every night. He tried to silence his doubts by focusing on discipline. He cleaned his weapon meticulously, checked his gear twice, sometimes 3 times. He studied maps, memorized routes, and practiced breathing techniques to calm his hands. But nothing erased the gnawing fear inside him. The fear that when the critical moment came, his body would betray him, and he'd be the reason a general didn't make it home. One night at the forward operating base, Shaw sat outside beneath a sky littered with stars. The desert was strangely quiet, the kind of silence that felt more dangerous than comforting. A fellow soldier, Tors, plopped down beside him. Tors wasn't cruel like some of the others, but he wasn't gentle either. "You ever think about what happens if you choke out there?" Tors asked, not unkindly but bluntly. Shaw didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the horizon, the tremor in his hand making the cigarette he held glow in shaky patterns. Finally, he said, "Every day." Tors exhaled, shaking his head. "Then don't. You've just gotta not think. When it's time, act. I'll kill you faster than a bullet." Easier said than done, Shaw thought. As the days stretched into weeks, Shaw grew accustomed to the rhythms of deployment. The long patrols, the sudden adrenaline spikes when something felt wrong, the endless heat. But the doubts never left him. Every time his hands shook, he imagined the whispers, "Shaky Shaw." Every time he looked at the general, he imagined failing him. What Shaw couldn't see, though, what none of them could see, was how close he was to the moment that would define his life. A moment when the doubts, the nickname, and the tremor would collide with a test so sharp and sudden that even the most seasoned soldiers would hesitate. And in that moment, the world would find out whether Shaky Shaw was a soldier defined by his weakness or a hero forged by it. The convoy wound its way through a narrow mountain pass, engines growling against the steep incline. Dust rose in choking clouds, clinging to uniforms and stinging eyes. Shaw sat in the back of a Humvee, rifle across his lap, scanning the jagged ridges above them. He hated mountain roads. Too many blind turns, too many vantage points for anyone with a rifle and patience. The general's armored vehicle rolled ahead, solid and imposing, a target that seemed to scream its importance. Every soldier in the convoy knew it. If the enemy was watching, they'd aim for that vehicle first. Shaw's stomach tightened. His eyes darted to the. He saw nothing but rock and shadow, yet a knot of unease twisted inside him. He had learned to trust that feeling, instinct born from weeks of tension and endless patrols. Something was wrong. Then it happened. The explosion came without warning, a thunderous crack that ripped through the earth. The lead vehicle lifted violently off the ground, then crashed back down in a plume of smoke and fire. The blast wave hit Shaw's Humvee like a hammer, rattling his bones and sending his helmet into the metal frame. His ears rang, the world turning into a distorted blur of chaos. "Contact, contact," voices screamed through the comms. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the canyon. Muzzle flashes sparked from hidden crevices high above, turning the ridges into death traps. Bullets pinged off metal, shattered glass, and tore into the earth around them. The convoy ground to a halt. Soldiers scrambled for cover, returning fire in desperate bursts. Shaw's hands shook violently as he ducked behind the Humvee door. The familiar taunt Shaky Shaw rushed into his mind, louder than the explosions. His rifle felt heavier than ever, slick with sweat. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, to push past the ringing in his ears. The general's vehicle had stalled in the middle of the road, pinned down by a hail of bullets. Through the haze of smoke, Shaw saw himself, helmet on, barking orders unflinching. Even under fire, the general's presence was unyielding. His voice cut through the chaos, commanding soldiers to reposition, to hold the line, to push forward. But Shaw could see what the general couldn't. The enemy had the high ground. The convoy was exposed, boxed in by sheer rock walls. The attackers had planned this well. Another blast shook the pass, showering the soldiers with rock and dirt. Shaw flinched, his heart slamming against his chest. His hands trembled as he loaded a fresh magazine. For a brief moment, panic threatened to consume him. He could almost hear the voices of the other recruits. "You'll freeze, Shaw. You'll blow it when it counts." Then he caught sight of something that cut through the fear. Near the general's vehicle, a young private lay on the ground, clutching a bleeding leg. He screamed for help, pinned down by gunfire. Shaw didn't think he moved. Sliding from cover, he sprinted toward the soldier, bullets kicking up dirt at his heels. His body screamed for him to stop, but he didn't. Grabbing the private by the vest, Shaw dragged him behind the safety of a rock outcrop. The private gasped in pain, but Shaw barely noticed. His eyes locked back onto the ridges. Smoke, fire, movement, everywhere he looked was chaos. But then something sharper caught his attention. On the far ridge, just beyond the shifting smoke, he spotted a glint of metal. His heart dropped. It wasn't just random spraying bullets. Someone was positioning with intent, with patience. Shaw's stomach knotted. He knew that silhouette. He knew that long, steady barrel. A sniper. And from the angle, Shaw realized the horrifying truth. The general was directly in the line of fire. Time seemed to slow, every detail sharpening. The crackle of rifles faded, the shouting of soldiers dimmed. Even the sting of smoke in his lungs disappeared. All Shaw could see was the sniper crawling into position, adjusting his sights. His hands trembled as he lifted his rifle. He tried to steady the scope, but the crosshairs jumped wildly with the shake of his fingers. Panic surged again. His mind screamed, "You can't do this. You'll miss. You'll fail him. You'll fail everyone." The name Shaky Shaw thundered louder than ever, echoing through his skull. But he couldn't look away. He couldn't stop, because if he did, the general would die. And Daniel Shaw knew this was the moment that would decide not only the general's fate but his own. The world had narrowed to a single image, a shadowed figure on the ridge, belly pressed to the dirt, long rifle extended like an extension of his body. The sniper. He was calm, deliberate, everything Shaw felt he was not. Shaw could see the man adjusting, inching his weapon toward the armored vehicle below, toward the general. The scope glinted briefly in the harsh Afghan sun, and that tiny flash was all Shaw needed to confirm the danger. A chill coursed through him despite the desert heat. His breath caught. His hands, already trembling, seemed to shake harder, as if mocking him in the worst possible moment. He raised his rifle, pressed it to his shoulder, and peered through the scope. The sniper's silhouette blurred, dancing in and out of the crosshairs as the tremor rippled through his fingers. "You'll never hold it steady." The voices from training haunted him. "He's shaky. He'll blow it when it matters." Below, General continued shouting commands, utterly unaware of the danger lurking above. He moved with certainty, pointing, rallying his men. Shaw realized the sniper wasn't aiming for just any target. He was waiting for the exact moment the general exposed himself. One pull of the trigger, and the ambush would go from dangerous to catastrophic. Shaw's mouth went dry. Sweat poured down his temples, stinging his eyes. He blinked hard, trying to clear the haze. His finger hovered near the trigger, but doubt clenched his chest like a vice. His rifle shook. The crosshairs refused to stay still. For a heartbeat, he lowered the weapon, pressing his back against the rock. His lungs heaved, sucking in smoke and dust. He wanted to believe someone else would see it, that another soldier would act, but deep down he knew it was him or no one. He was the only one with the angle. He forced himself to look again. Through the scope, the sniper's face came into sharper view, expressionless, focused, steady. He looked like every nightmare Shaw had ever imagined, the perfect predator, patient and unflinching. And Shaw was shaking. His heart thundered so loud it seemed to echo through his helmet. The rifle felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He thought of Sergeant's words, "One slip and it's over." He thought of Tor's blunt warning, "I'll kill you." But most of all, he thought of the nickname, Shaky Shaw. The laughter, the smirks, the taunts. Years of being underestimated, defined by the one flaw he couldn't control. Rage flickered inside him. Not at the soldiers who mocked him, not even at the sniper in his sights, but at himself, for believing them, for letting that name become his truth. He pressed the rifle to his shoulder. His hand still trembled, but now he forced himself to focus not on the shaking, but on the rhythm of it. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. It had a pattern, a wave. If he could time his breath with the motion, maybe, just maybe, he could find a still point in the storm. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled. The crosshairs swayed, then steadied for the briefest moment. The sniper adjusted his position, settling into the kill shot. The general shifted below, stepping into view. This was it, seconds, maybe less, before the sniper fired. Shaw tightened his grip, every muscle screaming against the tremor. His vision tunneled, everything beyond the scope fading away. The crosshairs hovered over the sniper's chest, dipped, then rose again. He whispered under his breath, barely audible, "Not today." And he began to squeeze the trigger. The sound of his own heartbeat drowned out the battlefield noise. He didn't hear the gunfire around him, didn't hear the shouts of soldiers scrambling for cover. All that existed was the pressure of his finger, the tremor of his hands, and the certainty that this shot was the only thing standing between the general and death. Whether he succeeded or failed, the next second would define him forever. The world hung still, balanced on the thin edge of a trigger pull. Shaw's finger tightened, the rifle trembling against his shoulder. Every breath, every heartbeat felt like a drum pounding inside his head. The sniper on the ridge was poised, steady, unflinching. The general stood exposed below, issuing commands, unaware that death had him in its sights. For Shaw, there was no more time to doubt. Either he took the shot, or he lived the rest of his life knowing he had watched a man die. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the hot, smoky air. His hands shook, the scope quivering, the crosshairs sliding off the target. Panic clawed at him. The name Shaky Shaw roared in his mind. It was all he could hear. For a moment, despair threatened to take him. What if they were right? What if this was exactly the moment everyone had predicted, when his weakness would destroy him? But then, cutting through the chaos, came a memory, his mother's voice, clear, calm, unwavering. "Strength isn't about never shaking, Daniel. It's about what you do while you're shaking." Something clicked inside him. He stopped fighting the tremor, stopped cursing it. Instead, he embraced it. The shake was part of him, yes, but it had rhythm, a subtle sway. He realized he could time it, ride it, find the split second of balance when everything aligned. He exhaled slowly, letting the tremor move with his breath. The crosshairs drifted, dipped, then rose. He waited, heart hammering, until the sway carried them back onto target. For one brief heartbeat, the sniper's chest filled the scope perfectly. Shaw squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the recoil jolting his shoulder. For an instant, he thought he'd missed. Then, through the drifting smoke, he saw the sniper jerk backward violently, his rifle clattering down the rocks. The man collapsed against the ridge, motionless. Silence followed, at least in Shaw's mind. The gunfire around him, the shouting, the chaos, all of it faded. There was only the sight of the sniper sprawled lifeless on the ridge, and the dawning realization of what had just happened. He had done it. The general, still shouting orders, never even knew how close death had come. But Shaw knew. He had seen it in the sniper's steady aim, felt it in his bones. 1 second more, one hesitation, and would have been gone. Shaw's chest heaved, the adrenaline surging through him like fire. His hands still shook, but now he looked at them differently. Those trembling fingers had pulled the trigger. Those unsteady hands had done what no one believed they could. "Sniper down," someone yelled across the comms. The word spread like electricity. Soldiers glanced toward Shaw's position, eyes wide. The nickname that once carried mockery now echoed with awe. Shaky Shaw got him. Shaw ducked back behind cover as bullets continued to snap overhead. The fight wasn't over, but something inside him had shifted forever. He peeked back over the rock, scanning the ridge. The sniper's body hadn't moved. Shaw confirmed the kill, then redirected his aim toward another cluster of muzzle flashes. This time, when he pulled the trigger, there was no hesitation. Confidence filled him, raw and unshakable. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't steady, but he had proved, at the moment it mattered most, that he was enough. Minutes stretched into eternity as the firefight raged on. Grenades thundered, rifles cracked, soldiers shouted and scrambled. Yet through it all, Shaw felt a clarity he'd never known before. He no longer fought against the tremor. He fought with it. When the enemy began to retreat, slipping back into the mountains, Shaw finally lowered his rifle. Sweat drenched his uniform, dust caked his face, and his ears still rang from the gunfire. But a new calm settled over him. He looked down at his shaking hands. For the first time, he didn't feel shame. He felt pride. Those hands had saved a life. More than a life, they had saved a leader, a symbol, a man whose death could have changed everything. The impossible shot had been made, and Daniel Shaw, once mocked as Shaky Shaw, had taken it. The mountains quieted at last, though the echoes of battle still clung to the air. Smoke drifted like low clouds across and the smell of burnt powder lingered. Soldiers were still moving, calling to one another, checking for wounds, dragging ammunition packs back into place. The firefight had been brutal, but it was over. And in the midst of the aftermath, one story already began to take shape. It started as a whisper among the squad closest to Shaw. "He took the shot," one soldier muttered, still staring up at the ridge where the enemy sniper had fallen. "Shaky Shaw, he actually hit him." The nickname rolled off his tongue out of habit, but there was no mockery in it now. Only disbelief, tinged with admiration. Others overheard. Heads turned toward Shaw, who was still crouched behind his firing position, catching his breath. His hands still trembled violently as he reloaded, but his face was steady, his eyes hard. Word spread like fire on dry grass. Shaw had saved the general. "Is it true?" one voice asked. "He nailed him, clean shot, saw it myself." Through the smoke with those hands. Every retelling added a new layer, details swelling with awe. By the time it reached the forward command tent, the story already carried the weight of legend. General himself heard it first from his aide. "Sir, you were targeted," the man said breathlessly. Enemy sniper, high ground. One of ours took him out. The general frowned, startled. Who? Private Daniel Shaw. The name caught off guard. He had heard it before, always in passing, always with a half smile or shake of the head. Shaw's reputation preceded him. The kid who couldn't hold his rifle straight. The one they called Shaky Shaw. Yet here he was, the soldier who had prevented its own death. The general looked across the field, scanning until his gaze landed on Shaw. The young private was still kneeling in the dirt, rifle across his lap, too stunned to notice he'd become the center of attention. Walked toward him. The chatter among the troops fell into a hush. Men who'd just been shouting orders and checking weapons suddenly stilled, eyes following the general as he approached. Shaw scrambled to his feet when he realized who was coming. His salute was sloppy, his hands visibly trembling. For a second, he thought the general might scold him for weakness, the way instructors had during training, but only studied him in silence, measuring. "You took the shot," the general finally said. Shaw swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." "And you got him?" "Yes, sir." Stern expression softened into something almost like a smile. "Then you saved my life, soldier, and maybe the lives of half the men here." The words hit Shaw harder than any bullet could. He felt his chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with something he couldn't name. Pride, relief, disbelief, all tangled together. The general clasped a hand on Shaw's shoulder, firm and unshakable. "Good work, damn good work." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the troops. A commendation like that, given so openly in the middle of the field, meant everything. Shaw's comrades, men who had rolled their eyes at him, laughed at his shaking hands, now looked at him with something new in their eyes. Respect. One soldier slapped him on the back. Another muttered, "You're not just Shaky Shaw anymore." But Shaw knew the name wouldn't disappear overnight. It didn't need to. For the first time, he didn't hate it, because now the name meant something different. It wasn't a mark of weakness. It was a reminder of the day he had stared down the impossible and pulled the trigger anyway. By nightfall, the story had traveled beyond their unit. Radio chatter carried it to nearby companies. Field reports marked it in official logs. Rumors even began weaving through the local villages where translators picked up the talk. An American soldier with shaking hands who had still made the shot. Shaw lay awake in his cot that night, listening to the low murmur of voices outside. Every time his name came up, a strange warmth spread through him. For so long, he had been the soldier everyone underestimated. Now, whether he liked it or not, he had become something else entirely. A symbol. And though the war was far from over, though tomorrow would bring another battle, another ridge, another risk of death, he knew he would face it differently now. The doubt was gone. In its place was purpose. Word had spread, and once it did, there was no stopping it. Morning broke over the camp with a pale, dusty light. The battle from the day before already felt like a story from another lifetime, but its impact still pulsed through every corner of the unit. Soldiers moved differently, less hurried, more alive, as if they had survived something worth remembering. And everywhere Shaw went, eyes followed him. At first he tried to ignore it. He kept his head low, focused on his duties, cleaning his rifle, checking supplies, double-checking gear. But whispers trailed him like shadows. "That's him. The one who saved the general. Did you hear how far the shot was?" Shaw wasn't used to the attention. For months, he had lived on the margins, half invisible, a walking joke no one took seriously. Now he couldn't walk 5 feet without someone mentioning his name. It unsettled him, but it also lit a fire inside. For the first time, he believed he belonged. General, too, wasn't done with him. Later that day, Shaw was summoned to the command tent. He expected paperwork, maybe a quick debrief. Instead, the general stood waiting with a handful of senior officers, maps spread out across the table. "Private Shaw," began, his voice calm but commanding. "We need you." Shaw blinked, uncertain. "Sir." The general gestured to the map. The enemy, been using high ground positions to pin us down. Yesterday proved something. You see angles others don't. You don't flinch when it matters. I want you on Overwatch for our next push. Shaw's stomach flipped. Overwatch, the job given to the best shots, the ones trusted to guard entire squads from unseen threats. Him, the soldier everyone had once doubted. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. From that moment everything shifted. He was no longer assigned to grunt work or shoved into background positions. He became part of the spear tip, an extra set of eyes, a guardian from above. His hands still shook, but with every mission, he learned how to control the rhythm, how to wait for the tremor's pause. The men he watched over began to trust him, calling his name with confidence rather than doubt. One mission after another, Shaw proved himself. He spotted ambushes before they struck. He called out enemy positions with uncanny accuracy. And when the shots mattered most, he didn't miss. Back in the barracks, the nickname Shaky Shaw took on a new meaning. Soldiers used it with a grin now, a term of endearment, even respect. "Glad Shaky's watching over us," one would say. "Yeah," another would laugh. "I'll take his shake over anyone steady." But the turning point wasn't just in how his unit saw him. It was in how Shaw began to see himself. Late at night, when the camp grew quiet, he sometimes thought back to training days, to the ridicule and the shame. He remembered staring at his hands in frustration, wishing they would stop betraying him. Now he realized they had never betrayed him at all. His shaking hands had carved his path, had forced him to find a different kind of precision, one that came not from steadiness but from patience, timing, and heart. The general noticed the change too. One evening, after a successful mission, found Shaw cleaning his rifle by the fire. He sat down beside him, uncharacteristically casual. "You know," Private said, "I've seen men break under pressure, men with nerves of steel who cracked when it counted, but you," he paused, his eyes sharp. "You've got something they don't. You know how to keep fighting even when your body says you can't. That's rarer than perfect aim." Shaw didn't know what to say. Praise from the general still felt surreal, like a dream he might wake from. But he carried those words with him, deep in his chest, where no doubt could touch them. By then, his story was already reaching beyond their unit. Field reports spread through command channels. Military journalists began knotting it in dispatches. A narrative was forming. The trembling soldier who expectation, the man who turned a weakness into his greatest strength. It was no longer just about saving the general. It was about proving that courage comes in many forms, that even a man nicknamed Shaky could stand steady when the world needed him most. And in the heart of war, where life was measured 1 second at a time, that truth became a beacon, not only for Shaw but for everyone who heard his story. Years later, when the dust of that war had long settled and new conflicts had risen in faraway places, the name Daniel Shaw still carried weight. Soldiers came and went, battles were fought and forgotten, but the story of Shaky Shaw lived on. It began first as campfire talk, young recruits whispering about the trembling private who had saved a general's life. Then it appeared in military newsletters, retold by officers who admired how Shaw had turned doubt into duty. Eventually, it spread into books, documentaries, and lectures at West Point. The tale of the man mocked for his shaking hands, who still found the courage to pull the trigger when no one else could, became a parable for resilience. Shaw himself never sought fame. When he returned home, he carried his uniform neatly folded in a trunk and lived a quiet life. The war had left scars, some visible, others hidden deep, but he wore them with a kind of humility that impressed even those who didn't know his history. He took a job at a local school as a custodian, sweeping hallways, fixing broken windows, lending an ear to children who needed someone to listen. Most who met him never guessed what he had done overseas. But word has a way of finding light. Veterans who had served with him would stop by from time to time. They would shake his hand firmly, look him in the eye, and say, "You saved us." The students overheard whispers, then asked questions. Slowly, pieces of the legend returned to him, carried by others who believed it mattered too much to forget. One afternoon, years after the war, Shaw was invited to a ceremony at a military academy. He thought it was a small event, maybe a medal presentation. But when he arrived, he found himself standing before a packed auditorium. Rows of cadets, their uniforms sharp and eyes eager, filled the room. At the front, a banner read, "Courage Under Fire, the story of Daniel Shaky Shaw." As the general, older now, with gray at his temples, stepped up to the podium, Shaw realized what was happening. Himself had insisted Shaw attend, and in front of hundreds of future officers, the general told the story. He spoke of that day in the mountains, of how death had hovered only seconds away. He spoke of the trembling young man who had been the last line between survival and tragedy. And he spoke of the truth Shaw embodied, that courage is not the absence of fear or weakness, but the act of rising above them. When finished, the entire auditorium rose to its feet in thunderous applause. Shaw, standing to the side, felt his chest tighten. He wasn't used to praise, wasn't comfortable in the spotlight. But as he looked at the cadets, faces shining with respect, some even with tears, he realized this was no longer about him. It was about them. His story had become something larger, something that could inspire others who felt broken, doubted, or less than perfect. If even one cadet left that room believing that their own flaws could one day become strengths, then the name Shaky Shaw had done its job. Back home, Shaw still lived simply. He walked with a slight limp, his hands trembling as much as they ever had. But now, when he looked at them, he didn't see weakness. He saw history. He saw the ridge, the crosshairs, the single breath that had changed everything. And though he never called himself a hero, the people around him did. In small towns, in veterans' halls, in classrooms, his name was spoken with reverence. Parents told their children about him. Teachers used his story in lessons about courage. Soldiers invoked him in moments of fear, reminding each other that even shaking hands can steady the world when it matters most. Daniel Shaw never asked to be remembered, but he was. Because once, in the fire of battle, a trembling private took the shot that saved a general's life, and in doing so, redefined what it meant to be brave.